Hey, I'm Bobby,
And I'm Matthew.
and today we'll be discussing the pros and cons of critical race theory in the classroom.
Before we start explaining the main differences on critical race theory, let us first understand what critical race theory is. In simple terms, critical race theory tries to understand how racism has shaped U.S. laws and how those laws still affect people of color today.
So this theory tries to show the relationship between American racism and American laws, but where does that fit into the classroom? Educators across the U.S. have expanded their curriculum on racial inequality by including lessons that highlight the difficulty of people of color experiences in the United States. These types of lesson plans would be restricted under a critical race theory ban from the government.
So what are the supporters of critical race theory saying? Supporters believe that critical race theory should be integrated into students' U.S. civics and history lessons. They believe that lessons should address systemic racism in our country, and history lessons should include the experiences of marginalized people. Supporters say discussing race creates more inclusive schools and helps students overcome systemic barriers restricting their achievement.
So what was the reason Florida and other states banned critical race theory in the classroom? Opposers of critical race theory say teachers are trying to rewrite history and should not consider race when interacting with students. Opposers also believe that racism is the product of hateful individuals, not the product of the American system. Republican lawmakers claim that critical race theory would promote division, negativity, and shame in identifying as an American.
This issue is one that has many perspectives, but now I'd like to shift the conversation to you. With the evidence you just heard, what do you think about critical race theory?
Are you passionate about social and environmental justice, always wanting to solve the world's big problems? The Social Impact Hub at Rollins College is here to help you create solutions. The Social Impact Hub is a creative space on the Rollins College campus that provides tools and resources to support you addressing local and global social issues. With a new design lab where you can come together with other passionate people to engage in innovation and active change making, there is no limit to what you can achieve. To find out more, head on over to...
Welcome back, you guys. In today's show, we're going to be discussing critical race theory. We're going to explain what critical race theory is, why it's important, what's happening with the critical race theory ban in Florida and other states, as well as having an amazing guest share their thoughts. But before we get into the topic, Matthew, would you mind explaining what Impact Now's mission is?
Of course. The Impact Now radio show's goal is to take complex topics that affect the world and explain them in a very simple way. Most importantly, we tell you different ways you can make a positive impact now.
Perfectly said. So as we said, today we're going to be discussing the critical race theory ban in Florida. But before we begin, we should define some terms that will be coming up a lot in this episode. Critical race theory, or CRT, arose out of the legal tradition in the U.S. in the aftermath of the 1960s civil rights movement. CRT considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, and even feelings and the unconsciousness. Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the foundations of the system we live in, asking, how can we solve the root of our problem?
Perfectly explained, Bobby. CRT focuses on institutional racism, with institutional racism being the ways in which institutional policies and practices create different outcomes for different racial groups. Its core idea is that race is a social construct, and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policies.
The basic tenets of critical race theory, or CRT, as we said before, emerged from a framework for legal analysis in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It was created by legal scholars Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, among others.
It's important to recognize, though, that one of the underlying tenets of CRT, the idea that we as people have intersectional identities, is one that's been explored for centuries, particularly in Black feminist thought. For example, Sojourner Truth's famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, given in 1851, discusses Truth's thoughts and her intersectional identity as both a Black woman and what it means to exist in the intersections of Blackness and womanhood.
Now that we've discussed the basics of CRT, let's dive into what is happening in Florida and other states with bans on teaching it in schools. On July 26, the Florida State Board of Education introduced a new rule for public schools and required topics that must be taught with this rule, stating that Instruction on the required topics must be factual and objective, and may not suppress or distort significant historical events. This rule continues by giving examples of theories that distort historical events and states, quote, the teaching of critical race theory, meaning the theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons.
This ban on teaching CRT in public schools here in Florida is an example of a panic spreading across the U.S. about how history and race are taught about in public schools. For example, a school district in Pennsylvania, the Central York High School District, is facing protests by students and other concerned individuals after the all-white school board unanimously banned a list of educational resources that included a children's book about Rosa Parks, Malala Yousafzai's autobiography, and CNN's Sesame Street Town Hall on Racism. Likewise, in Texas, a new law, HB 3979, went into effect earlier this month that restricts discussions about race and history in schools. So now that we've looked at all of that, Bobby, what do you think about critical race theory and just what's happening in Florida and other states in general?
Well, I think that it definitely is. It's an insane issue. I think that first, in order to talk about this, we have to discuss education. I mean, I know myself. I had a lot of my education in Florida, from K through, or not K, from first grade all the way till senior year of high school. I learned in the U.S. education system, and being in it, you kind of realize that there are some things that are left out of history. Maybe there's some things that are included. There's this difference of you don't really know what you don't know until you learn it. What about you?
So for me, I'm an international student, right? And so where I'm from, the Bahamas, race and the talk about race has been something that was core to my education, from probably K3 or whatever. We started learning about it was an age appropriate talk about race and what that means, because it's really wrapped up in the history of where I'm from and just the world in general. And so my teachers thought it was important that we have that conversation, right? But I also know that there are people both at home and in the United States, right, who talk about the fact that maybe race as a concept, or racism and what's happening shouldn't be talked about in schools and shouldn't be talked about to students, right? Maybe that's something that should be left to families and left for personal decisions.
No, absolutely. But I mean, in your history class, you mentioned that you're an international student, but in your history class, did you feel as if you had a complete history?
I would say, I mean, obviously, any history class is gonna be biased, right? And it's supposed to be a broad overview. It's not gonna completely give you every single thing, right? There is a level of you need to go outside, do some work. But I think that for me at least, it was a pretty good overview. I feel we touched upon a lot of things, and it gave me a lot of opportunities to be oh, I didn't think about this thing before. Maybe I should go research and learn about it a little more, And I know, at least in my experience, having talked to U.S. students, I know that sometimes I'll mention things that me and other international students think about as being just common knowledge, and then certain U.S. students would be oh, I didn't even know that, we didn't learn that in history, and I'm just really surprised every time.
No, absolutely. Well, I think that in regards to critical race theory in education, that becomes the topic of debate. Not should it be allowed, but to what extent should we allow it? Of okay, there's so much history, and there's so if we start expanding what we have to teach, then it's okay, well, what should we teach? Should we teach about I guess what topics are most important to teach? To be the most inclusive in a history class, because obviously some people, they go, well, we should teach about the Tulsa massacre and we should teach about Juneteenth, but then it's well, then we should also be teaching about the Hispanic Revolution movement, and we should be teaching about what's going on in different countries. So should that become the conversation, or how do you feel about that? What topics should we be putting in a history class?
I think that at least for my understanding, I feel when it comes to U.S. racial history, I feel it very much goes independence, the country, the U.S. was founded, and then we get into slavery occurred, right? And then depending on where you are, they talk about different waves of immigration, and then from there, right? I think it's really interesting, because normally it goes to, we have Abraham Lincoln. He's freeing enslaved people. And after that, like we skip ahead a couple like centuries, right? Like a century or two, right? And then we get into the civil rights movement of the 1960s, 1970s, and then after that we go to like Barack Obama becomes president, and that's it, right? I don't really think that and obviously this depends on like where you are and where you're coming from, but I think that especially like here in Florida, when you consider like the amount of like history tied into race, like is like a part of like Floridian history, right? I think it's like really interesting that that is not spoken about.
No, absolutely. Like I couldn't agree more. I think that it definitely is one of those topics where it's like, as I said, it shouldn't be a matter of like, should we be including in education? It's to what extent are we doing it? And I mean, there's plenty of questions that stem from that, because I think that any good issue in politics has to, it has to have like this long list of questions. But yeah, I mean, hopefully, if we do our show correctly, we'll be answering as many of those questions as possible, or at least discussing those questions. But I definitely agree with you that in terms of like Florida history, in terms of American history, there's just so much to cover. But it's so tough to figure out what should we teach our students in that K through 12 time frame that we have, and then most importantly is like, when are they allowed to learn about this racial injustice? Like would it be okay for us to teach a kindergartner about a racial injustice that happened in America? And if we aren't teaching kindergartners, when does that age become appropriate? When does that grade begin that we are able to teach them?
Definitely, like I think that's like a really interesting concept, like the idea of like age in relation to like race talks, right? Like talking about race, like especially in school, because like depending on like your like phenotype, right? Like what you look like, and like depending on like your race, right? Like you have, depending on who you are, like you've been racialized from a very young age, right? And so like if you're like a person of color, right, and like you are like very visibly so, right? Like you're not like, particularly like white passing, you don't really get to like grow up and exist not having like thinking about race, right? Like it's like very much a privilege to be able to like go through life and not really need to think about like race or how you relate to other people racially until like it say comes up in school, or like there like something happens in the news, right? Because like when you're like young and say you're like black or Latino or like Asian, right? Like you can very visibly see like the differences between you and like say your like white classmates, right? And so like, and also depending on like your family may be having those conversations, and so I think it's a really interesting like nuanced take on like where do we like fit in all of these people that school is meant to include,
No, absolutely. I mean, like I said, there's like this whole discussion on the topic, but yeah, like I think that in today's show we should definitely dive into what age becomes that appropriate age. And obviously, most of today's show is going to be opinion based. We really just implore our audience to listen to us, listen to those varying opinions. If you hear something that you disagree with, please like listen on to it, try and understand that viewpoint. And if you hear something that you agree with, then I suppose that's a good thing, because then we're confirming what you already believe in. But like in Impact Now, like one of the biggest things that we hope for our audience is that they'll listen to these political discussions, or they'll listen to our show topics, and they'll find something that they didn't know, or maybe that they disagreed with. Because I think that will be our kind of meter of how much progress has been made. Either way, we have a very, very fantastic show planned for today. We have an amazing guest that's going to be coming back. We have coming back after our music, and we also have a really, really great playlist. Matthew made it himself, so I already know it's going to be the best playlist.
Well, that's a bit high, but hopefully you all enjoy it.
No, I know you will. Either way, we will be back with our guest with more political discussion, and stay tuned.
Are you passionate about social and environmental justice? Always wanting to solve the world's big problems? The Social Impact Hub at Rollins College is here to help you create solutions. The Social Impact Hub is a creative space on the Rollins College campus that provides tools and resources to support you addressing local and global social issues. With a new design lab where you can come together with other passionate people to engage in innovation and active change making, there is no limit to what you can achieve. To find out more, head on over to @Rollins Social Impact Hub on Instagram for more info.
And we are back. I hope that you enjoyed that song. It's by like one of my favorite new artists, Yola. I'm just hoping that you're enjoying the music and the conversation altogether. But like Bobby said, we're gonna have a really great discussion. We have a really amazing guest in studio. They're a student at Rollins, Kelsey Eelman. They are a senior, budding journalistic personality featured in the Orlando Sentinel, and a really amazing debater, and just a really great individual to talk about these kinds of things. Kelsey, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are y'all today?
Great,
Yeah,
Bobby.
doing well. Yeah,
Doing well?
can't complain. I mean, I have homework today, so like that's always a bummer. But other than that, I think today's a pretty good day. Yeah. Either way, I think that before you got here, we were talking about critical race theory. We were talking about how critical race theory is kind of that. It's that like trying to attempt to figure out how racism and U.S. law intersect with one another. And then our discussion kind of led to, like how do we feel about it? Like Matthew and I's personal opinion, our educational background. So where did we go to school? And we led into like a multitude of things. But what we really want to get from you is, for the first part, is just what are your thoughts on critical race theory? On the ban that's happening in Florida. Just give us a brief idea of what you feel about that.
I find this whole conversation about critical race theory in the United States and critical race theory on like an educational scale very interesting because it was something that you wouldn't encounter in education until like graduate level courses or something of that nature. So I find it almost ironic that was like the hill that the ultra conservative chose to die on because it didn't really exist in the classroom at all until they decided to start banning it in the classroom. And I think that there should be some level of education for K through 12 youth regarding like systematic injustice and unconscious bias in the United States. Like I think it's very important, or at least an accurate picture of like US history that isn't given, especially like in the South. But when it comes to actual critical race theory, that's not what they're banning from classrooms. So I just, again, find this like equivocation on what critical race theory actually looks like and this conflation really interesting. And I find the way that they're trying to put it into law even more interesting, like the ban itself that they're trying to enact.
Well, do you feel as if, because many people who don't support this ban say that this is an impediment on our First Amendment right of freedom of speech, or at least to some capacity saying that you can't teach critical race theory in schools is an impediment on the freedom of speech right. Do you feel that that's to some extent true?
I feel like academic free speech doesn't exist in a K through 12 curricula in the same way that it exists in like higher education. There's actually just
well this does actually apply to some higher education institutions in some states.
Yeah, I have seen like in other states that it exists, but I just think that there is like a difference first like the academic free speech that might exist in like a K through 12 classroom versus it doesn't exist, but versus academic free speech on a college campus. So what's funny is that I've never actually even considered it from the perspective of this is impeding First Amendment rights, because for me that doesn't even feel like the biggest issue here. I think it's more about like what's actually happening underneath and what it's saying about our lawmakers and their feelings about American people. That's actually more concerning.
Yeah, I think like definitely like when I think about the nature of like both like free speech in a classroom, right, and just like the nature of critical race theory being like taught in the whole, right, like you said, until earlier this year, late last year, right, like critical race theory was something that only like legal academics, maybe like some other people in certain like other like fields would like discuss and talk about, like maybe like philosophy and stuff like that, right? Like it wasn't like this was something that like the general public or even like the general like academic community was really discussing in depth. And part of me feels like this like CRT when it comes to like lawmaking has, or just like legislation in general, really has become a bit of like a dog whistle, right? Like it's just like, ooh, CRTs in schools, like we need to like ban it, we need to like get it out, and it's just like what, like you said, like what actually is being taught in there that would come under the umbrella of CRT, right? Because like just talking about like civil rights or like talking about like say institutional or like systemic racism, like these are not concepts that are like solely based on like critical race theory principles, right? Like it's not like, I don't think that anybody in third grade is reading like Kimberly Crenshaw's like legal treatises and stuff like that, right? So it's like really interesting.
No, absolutely. I definitely feel that, yeah, you're right. Like that probably isn't the biggest issue with it. There's many more issues surrounding it, but I did think it was an interesting take on like, well, like how can you ban us from teaching real history? But that actually is a great segue into critical race theory and the foundation of it. And I think the most foundational question you can ask is what do you feel, where do you feel racism comes from? Of like, is it like critical race theory says that racism does in fact come from the American system or from, the systems in place from society? Or does racism come from an individual's hate/bias? So where do you think that comes from? And remember, this is all opinion based, so you're more than welcome to disagree. That was to the audience.
I mean, I've been thinking about where racism has come from and trying to parse out an answer for like the better part of my academic career, because that's something that was never discussed. You assumed racism was a hate between an individual and another individual based on skin color. That's what you're taught racism is, even if you maybe went to a high school or school that has better educational ideas on how we should discuss history. But I know that my first idea that I've come to is that racism is socially constructed. Socially constructed then is going to have to mean that there's multiple people involved. You really can't have a social construct between two individuals who happen to share a hatred for one another. Mm-hmm. So that's like my first thing there. Racism is socially constructed. My second thing is that social construction is somewhat flimsy until you put it into law. So the social construct, and I also, by the way, another caveat is I believe racism heavily relies on a power structure and not just hatred. There's a power dynamic and differential between people of color and specifically black people and then white people. They've created a power dynamic that is uneven in favor of white people and then put that into some actual black letter law as it's gone forward. I definitely think there's a heavier emphasis on it in Western legal systems, which have all also been influenced by the United States and the UK and the fun flavors of colonialism that have then spread across the rest of the world. But yeah, social construction gets a lot more powerful when you put it into law. So I don't think racism comes from law. I think racism was weaved into the law, and I think racism is a power differential and not just individual hatred, but that's how it manifests in our daily lives.
So in a way, it's like racism comes before the system. The system only strengthens it.
I don't think there's this is a chicken and the egg.
No, I know it is. Like it absolutely is.
I don't think necessarily racism came first because humans didn't really exist without some type of power structure or some type of hierarchical structure, and then it just became codified as language became used. So I think that they just are two things that happened at a similar time and went into the system together. And if you look at more foundational documents, if you read the U.S. Constitution, there's very clear racist undertones. In the Article 1, Section 9, they discuss that you can't ban slave trade until 1808. They had to put a caveat in. It's hey, we know it's going to bother people, so we have to specifically write it down that we're not going to touch your ability to trade slaves until the year 1808. And that's not in an amendment. That's in the first article, Section 9. So race, even though they didn't specifically mention the race of the people they're enslaving, it became very clear that documents are built with some types of ways to include the systemic racism into the system from the beginning.
Definitely. That makes me think about the nature of redlining, things like that, right? These are things that have historically happened, say with or without say a legislative push, and then eventually they become codified into law, right? And so I think that when you think about critical race theory as a concept and the way it tackles the fact that this is a bigger, deeper, embedded issue, right? Like you said, I think it's really important that we as a society are starting to experience that shift, right? A lot of the general public and a lot of us are starting to say, okay, maybe I grew up thinking that this was an individual thing, right? It's one person, this particular person is racist, or this particular person did something racist, right? But now we're all starting to think that, okay, how is the system and the world we live in, right? How is that being influenced by racism, right? Because if we know that people do if we assume that people do racist things, right, and we have enough of them in power, and then we assume that those people in power are making laws, and that will then influence things like how are we able to change those things, right? And I think that as much like as we've pointed out before, right, like CRT in and of itself is not being taught in schools, but I think that like this conversation around it, I think is really important to be like, okay, like what is happening? Because before you got here, we were talking about the fact that in Pennsylvania, the Central York like high school district is currently like placing like a ban on certain like race-related like books and topics, right? Like Malala Yousafzai's autobiography, like books about like Rosa Parks and stuff like that, right? And so like it really makes you think, what is that school board trying to ban, right? Because like what is the implicit assumption you're supposed to be getting from like reading things like that and like doing like certain activities and things of that nature?
Well, that's actually a fantastic segue of, do you think, we're obviously talking about how there's a system in place. It kind of solidifies this idea of racism, and we've established that. What do you think critical race theory in schools will do? Do you think that's actually going to help the issue? Do you think that it'll probably hinder the issue, as opposers say, that it will create this divided America? Like what extent does this critical race theory actually solve the issue rather than hurt it?
I don't necessarily think that critical race theory is going to solve
political. But like, do you think it's a solution? Like, obviously, it's not a fix-all, but is it a solution?
I don't think it's a solution. I don't think critical race theory is going to like solve political polarization based on racial lines in the United States. What I think is helpful though to young people, or could be helpful in their like educational career, it's going to be slightly uncomfortable at the time because you're young and you're having conversations that you didn't think you were going to have, and your parents are then going to have to field the questions coming from these conversations. But there's no solutions with comfort. There's no good, lasting, comfortable solution. So I think having discussions about like bias in the classroom and the fact that our systems are biased, racial injustice in our justice system because kids are taking civics courses and kids are going into like then eventually AP government or taking these classes that are foundational to your understanding of how you as a citizen and as an atom operate within this system. It's very important, but it's going to be really uncomfortable at first because for all the Black students or students of color, this is just a fact of your existence that you were taught in the home to understand that people are going to view you a different way. But then to have your white peers then confronted with it, it's going to be an uncomfortable process. But I don't think it's going to show up in at least K through 12 education in the way that's going to be so uncomfortable that it would be problematic to the point of necessitating a ban. So that's where I just think it's interesting.
Definitely. I think that what you're saying about like solutions and like thinking about like these processes, right? Like it's not comfortable, and I definitely agree. Like, and I also think like this is something that's been talked about a lot in like race, like social justice and stuff like circles, is that like you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Like if you're gonna be willing to grow and willing to change, right? You have to be willing to be uncomfortable. Obviously not to the extent like it's detrimental, right? And so like obviously when we're talking about like being in schools, like that's the ways in which like these conversations happen, like certain things, right? Like will be like modulated for like different ages, right? But like it's okay to be uncomfortable with the knowledge that like at the end of this process, like there is going to be like growth and there is like an ability and a chance for healing, right? Like I think like that's also like an important thing to talk about. Is like not just like are we having these conversations in schools, but like are schools then becoming places where like these conversations can be had and there is a space for like healing and like the kinds of necessary work to be done that help both like teachers, students, and parents, and really just like a community basis for like moving forward in like the ways in which the world works, right?
No, yeah, and I couldn't agree more, but I do think that, in regards to critical race theory, because obviously with this whole thing, it's not they're trying to teach critical race theory in the classroom. If we haven't made it clear, they're taking these critical race theory ideas and putting them into the classroom in ways of like, well, our history should include geez, that's such a tough word. Representative history of different marginalized groups, or civics lessons that explain, how laws came to be. So that's what we mean when we say critical race theory in the classroom. But Matthew and I, we kind of briefly touched over this, but I kind of want to expand on this topic more. Is like, when should race be taught to, like at what age is it appropriate to teach a kid about race what age is it appropriate for a kid to know about their country's, I guess, murky past? Like at what age do you think that would be, or what grade do you think that would be permissible to do?
I actually might have like a controversial take, but I think that maybe
that's what we like on this show.
I think questions of diversity and representation should be brought in as early as possible. If your child is reading a book or having a book read to them, there needs to be some level of representational like equity amongst authors and subjects, and also like having those conversations where you can establish, in the same way that you teach very, very young children to be nice to one another, let them understand that they need to be nice to everybody. So I think in that way, because I know that diversity training is often lumped in with these critical race theory bans. So question, like the word in several like Republican circles, they think like the word diversity is bad. They're scared of talking about diversity. So I think it's interesting to me. And I think that very young children should be taught to accept diversity, because at a very young age, children usually aren't predisposed to certain types of biases. So to make sure that you also foster the good behaviors when it comes to, and foster the good ideas in very young children, it's great. When it comes to these more critical topics about the like sordid past of the United States and how terrible it was, that needs to come in as soon as they're being taught history, because it is the history. Like we say this, like we can separate race from the conversation and we can separate diversity and compassion from the conversation, but you can't. If they are reading and learning, those are things they need to read and learn. It's actually just terrible that they have somehow managed to keep them out of those conversations. So then you have a very desensitized group of students who don't think that those things exist. And then as soon as someone brings it up, say they get to a college campus or something and somebody starts having conversations about race, they then think it's like politicized or controversial, when it's really just a fact of existence that we have now sadly had to deal with. And people have seen it in their daily lives. And again, I'll also mention for like Black students or for students of color, you have to have those conversations as soon as you are conscious, or else you can't navigate the world that you're in. So I think it's an extreme privilege that people get to decide when certain students, and by certain students, I mean students who are white, are exposed to those conversations. So I honestly think early, it's just you have to, again, moderate the level of conversation you're having. But again, that's my current opinion.
No, that's fair. But I think that raises kind of like this interesting question of like, is there any fear in your mind that if you do teach a young kid about a country's, past that may not be so pleasant, or are you scared in any way that you would be raising a future generation of kids who despise their country, who maybe don't have that same pride that they would if they didn't know those things? Like, do you think that the country's very future would be at stake if we started teaching them younger, like the bad stuff that we did?
Do we value national pride over basic human respect for individuals that we have wronged and continue to wrong? I don't think that you should be necessarily like, you shouldn't put one over the other, and you shouldn't look for complacency and false stability when people of color are now like being killed and having their lives destroyed by a system that wasn't built for them. So I think that you can be proud of the work you're doing as a nation to become better and to actually accept everyone who lives in that nation, or everyone who is coming here to be part of this nation, versus it's like the issue I had with like certain political slogans where like, or not slogans, slogans and slogos. Slogans.
Slogans and logos. It is in the morning.
Gosh. Those two words are too similar. But basically, they were trying to talk as if we had something to be extremely proud of in the past, but again, they're just erasing certain parts and then picking and choosing what they want to be proud of. I think America can be proud of its diversity and the mixture of viewpoints that we have in this country, but also we need to have certain allowances for actual human respect. So I don't think we should be afraid of what critical race theory is going to do to the future. Like, and again, critical race theory and scare quotes. I don't think we should be afraid of what critical race theory is going to do to the youth, but I think we should be excited for a group of people who actually understand our country, our legal system, the wrongs that have been committed and the wrongs that are like still being committed, and hopefully looking for real solutions to fix them. As you mentioned solutions earlier, because you can't find solutions without knowing there's a problem.
Definitely. I think like that's a really great point. And Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but it's been a really great conversation with you, Kelsey, and we hope that for all of you listening that you've enjoyed the conversation. We're going to have some great music, and we're just going to wrap up in a little bit, but we really appreciate you coming out to the studio.
Well, actually, wait, one last thing before we go.
Okay.
Yeah. The show's not going to end until 11, actually. No. We still end at 10. But the last question is just for anybody listening, who isn't a part of the youth, maybe they're our age, maybe they're a little bit older, what can they do if they do believe that critical race theory ideas should be taught in the classroom? Like how can they help rather than hurt?
I think reading up on certain types of educational initiatives like the 1619 Project and looking into actual unconscious bias training and things like that can be helpful. And also, again, in the state of Florida, if you're looking to possibly have some type of legislative sway, currently the critical race theory ban came from the Department of Education, which is a rule, so it's not actually in Florida law yet. So the rule only exists as this current iteration of the Florida Department of Education exists, and it is an appointed group of people, so they're appointed by our governor. Though our legislative session is about to begin in the state of Florida, and there's rumors and talk that a critical race theory ban is going to make it to the legislator, so then you now finally have the opportunity to bother your representatives in the state of Florida. For those living around Rollins, Anna Escamani is our great representative. So there's now opportunities for more voices to be heard in the discussion in Florida, whereas before it kind of happened in backroom dealings and then came to the forefront. So if you think that education should be more inclusive in the state of Florida, at least you now have opportunities to voice that opinion. Otherwise, just educating yourself before you then speak on the education of others.
Perfect. Yes. And now we can I just want to get in that last little bit. So Matthew, let's close out before a music break, then we'll close out.
Yeah, definitely. So like I was saying, I hope we really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you so much for that last point. And yeah, we're going to head over to some music now, and we'll be back.
Do you have a social enterprise you want to get off the ground? Looking for guidance for your great idea? Check out the Impact Incubator by the Rollins College Social Impact Hub. The Impact Incubator is a mentor and workshop-led program run each semester that helps student teams receive guidance and funding to pilot or launch a social enterprise idea. Teams are equipped with resources, networks, and actionable steps for turning ideas into impact-generating business models. Check out at Rollins Impact Incubator on Instagram for more info.
Was I hearing things, or did that song say "I hate the winter"?
No, you're quite right. It's Lord. She's in her solar power era. She's ready for the sun.
Yes, as she should be. I hate the winter too. That's why I live in Florida. But we had a very, very fantastic show, I think. We discussed a lot of great points about critical race theory ideologies in the classroom, critical race theory itself, what the ban means for Florida. As our amazing guest Kelsey mentioned, that that it's not actually, it's just a rule. It's not quite literally into effect yet, but you have to make sure you email your congressman or woman to make sure you're voicing out your opinion. Did I miss anything, Matthew?
No, I think that was good. And definitely, we really discussed the fact that this is an ongoing conversation, right? And the ways in which we talk about race is constantly shifting, as Kelsey like they mentioned, right? The ways in which we all think about racism, right? We've gone from thinking about it as an individual thing to now thinking about it as a systemic thing. And so I think that it's just really important that as we as a society evolve and start growing about the ways in which we talk about race, our educational institutions should also grow, right? We shouldn't be talking about race the same way we did in 2000, right? 20 years ago, the way we do in 2021, right? I think there should definitely be growth, evolution, and I think it's this is a really great opportunity with all of the things coming up now to have that conversation, to be critical, and to really think about what impact are we all making and our students and on ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's actually a wonderful segue to what I was going to say, which is how we can make an impact now. See what I did there? No. But to conclude the show, we do want to say if you're looking for more opportunities on Rollins campus or just in general for social justice or for impact projects, please check out the Social Impact Hub, which you can follow on Instagram at Rollins Social Impact Hub. Or just make sure that you tune into our Impact Now radio shows, which are bi-weekly. So we'll be having one not next Friday, but the Friday after. And what's going to be the show topic for that one?
Well, right now we're thinking we're probably going to talk about the United Nations, so I hope you all tune in and enjoy it.
Yes, perfect. Well, until then, thank you guys, and we hope that you learned how to make an impact now.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Impact Now. If you're looking to get in touch with us, our Instagram is @Rollins Social Impact Hub. You can subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. You can also hear us in Florida on WPRK 91.5 FM, the best in basement radio. Impact Now is produced by the Rollins College Social Impact Hub. This episode was produced by Matthew Deveaux. It was written by Matthew Deveaux and Bobby Sena.